Good afternoon. Hope you aren't tired yet of the FTA, as I heard that it was a long day for all of you. But I still have some quite interesting, I hope, information I wanted to share with you. So let's kick off. The presentation will be held in two parts. Part one, we will discuss the general origin rules that are long time existing in the EU, and specifically the origin rules that are taken up in the Korean EU FTA. So that will be part one of today. After the coffee break, we will speak about this special requirement, how to prove that the goods I send to Europe or vice versa, how to prove that these goods have European or Korean origin. We will discuss the requirements in the FTA, and we will discuss some interesting jurisprudence and doctrine that already exists for many years regarding other FTAs in the European Union, and that might be of interest for you Korean businesses that will, as of 1st of July, will be able to benefit from this FTA and vice versa, of course. But before we kick off on the FTA part, I have a very general introduction for you. And a general introduction on the EU, because we all talk about the EU-Korea FTA, but well, I want to be sure that we are talking about the same territories. So this is a map of the European Union. As you know, or don't know, but the European Union is composed of 27 member states. And these are the 27 member states that are part of the European Union. So if you are exporting goods to one of these 27 countries, you will be able to benefit from the preferential regimes that are applicable under the EU-Korea FTA. I mentioned those 27 member states. People sometimes find that stupid. They say, of course we know, the European Union, that's 27 member states. But even in Europe, there are plenty of people who do not know what those 27 member states are. And there is often confusion, especially on some countries that are not part of the European Union. Some people, they think if I'm exporting to Norway, well, Norway, that seems like a typically European country, so Norway, that must be part of the European Union, but it's not. Norway is not part of the European Union, so there are other rules that will be applicable if you export to Norway. Switzerland, for example. Very many people, they think, well, Switzerland, yes, indeed, must be part of the European Union, but it is not. The Swiss, they are strongly dependent on their neutrality, so they are not part of the European Union. The Norwegians, they are simply too rich to participate in the European Union. They say we will lose too much money if we join the European Union, and if we will be obliged to fund those southern countries like Greece and Portugal that make a mess of their own accounting. So they are not joining. No, this is the list of the 27 countries. Those are part. There are some ongoing negotiations with new members, but for example, Croatia, Serbia, even Turkey, which is a very tensive political issue, obviously. But for now, these are the 27 member states of the European Union. So the EU-Korea FTA will only be applicable if you export goods to one of those 27 countries. So what is the European Union, in fact, from a customs perspective? What is that kind of thing? Is it one country? Is it how should you see the European Union? from a customs perspective? Well, the European Union, from a customs perspective, is a customs union. Meaning that there are no custom duties on trade between the member states. If you export goods from England to the Netherlands, there will be no custom duties upon entry in the Netherlands. No, because those two countries, two of the 27 countries, they form this customs union, and all trade between the boundaries of those 27 countries, all trade within those boundaries is exempt from custom duties. There are no custom duties applicable. There are no internal trade barriers as well. So countries cannot impose anti-dumping duties or quotas or whatever economic measure that exists on goods that are being exported from the UK to the Netherlands, or from the UK to Spain, or from the UK to Bulgaria. And there's a common external tariff, and there are harmonized trade measures. What does that mean? Well, it means that wherever you enter your goods into the European Union, the same tariff is applicable. If you export your goods to Belgium and they are entered via the Antwerp harbor, your products will be subject to a certain tariff, and that tariff will be the same no matter where you import the goods. If you import in Antwerp, you import in Rotterdam, if you import in Spain or in Italy, if the goods are the same, the tariff will be the same all over the European Union. So that is important to remember. The same goes for the trade measures. If there is an anti-dumping duty on bicycles from China, that anti-dumping duty will be applicable if you import your goods in Antwerp, or if you import your goods somewhere in Spain. So that's important. The same rule goes for FTAs. All trade measures, whether there are bilateral FTAs that are agreed, like the EU-Korea FTA, or whether it's a unilateral FTA whereby European countries give preferences to goods coming from developing countries, like, for example, the South American countries or the African countries. Those measures are applicable no matter where you import your goods. And all the 27 member states, they engage in such a treaty. So that means that if you agree on an FTA with the European Union, it is applicable in all the 27 member states. That's something that we cannot forget. So as a remark, I can say that Europe is 27 member states. There is different legislation in all those 27 member states. But the thing that is unified the most within the European Union, that is customs and trade. I think it's probably that part of European legislation that is unified the most. It's the same in all the 27 member states. On what is the basis, the legal basis of this customs union in the European Union? Well, that's the Community Customs Code. It's a regulation. And it's important that you only have to remember two things when you're dealing with legislation with the European Union. The first thing is that there are two types of legislation. You have either regulations, either directives. And there are only two types of legislation in the European Union. Either it's a regulation, either it's a directive. What is the difference between those two types of legislation? It's a regulation that is a piece of legislation that is directly applicable in the 27 member states. It means that the European Council of Ministers, they decide on a piece of legislation, saying, for example, we agree on an FTA with EU-Korea, and these are the conditions. That piece of legislation that is directly applicable in all 27 member states. it has not. It doesn't have to be implemented in the 27 member states in national legislation. No, it's a piece of European legislation that is directly applicable in the 27 member states. Customs legislation is based on a regulation, what means that it is directly applicable in the 27 member states. The text, the legal texts that are the basis of the customs union and of all customs legislation are all regulations, and so they are all directly applicable in the 27 member states. That's a difference with VAT. I think I remember from a past life where I was working in Singapore and I was dealing with a Korean or an investment in Korea. I remember from that time that Korea also has a VAT system, so the concept is not unknown to you. So Europe has a VAT system with pretty high rates of VAT from, I think from 15 to 25%. So that's quite considerable. Well, in most cases, it's not a cost because it should be deductible. But it exists, and VAT legislation that is based on a directive. That means that on a European level, the Council of Ministers, the member states, they agree on some basic principles. And it's up to the member states to adapt those basic principles in national legislation. What has as a consequence that, for example, for VAT, the tariffs are different between the member states. If you import your goods in Antwerp, they will be subject, in principle, depending on the goods, but they will be subject to 21% of VAT. If you import your goods in Holland, they will be subject to 19% of VAT. If you import your goods in Luxembourg, it's a bit difficult. It's a small country and there's not so easy access, but if you would import your goods in Luxembourg, it would be subject to only 15% of VAT. It's true. It should not be a cost, but sometimes it can be an important element of pre-financing. So that is the difference. VAT legislation is based on a directive, means that all European countries have to implement that legislation in their national legislation, what in practice means that there are differences, for example, tariff differences. Customs legislation, trade legislation is the same, is based on a regulation, is the same in all 27 member states. So those are references to the customs code. It's based on a regulation from '92, so it's quite an old regulation, and it's subject to renewal, and it will be renewed as of 2013. The existing customs legislation will be replaced. The existing customs legislation will be replaced. There will be not so much changes. In practice, it will merely be an update of the old legislation, an update to the current circumstances. 1992, there was not much simplification, IT simplification going on. There were not much IT process, etc. 2011, there obviously are. So the customs code will be a little bit updated it will implement things like electronic declarations, etc., etc., etc. But one of the things that will change in 2013, well, that probably will change because there's a lot of discussion going on that, and I want to mention that to you because I believe that it's quite important. It has nothing to do with the FTA, but I think that if you are doing business with Europe on a long term, or well, on a short term, in fact, by 2013, there are some things that might change a lot. One of those things is the abolishment of the first sale for export rule. And the first sale for export rule states that when you, for example, when a Korean company produces goods worth 100 and they sell it to a Hong Kong sales entity of their own group for, let's say, 150, and the Hong Kong sales group sells those goods for 200 to an importer into the European Union. In principle, the tariff, the taxes, the import duties, the VAT is calculated on basis of the last transaction value. What means the value of the sale between Hong Kong and Europe, 200. But there are derogations to that rule, and one of the derogations is the first sale for export rule, and that says that if the first sale from Korea to Hong Kong was already a sale with destination Europe, you could apply, as importer into the European Union, you could apply the first transaction value, which was, I think, in my example, 150. So you could pay VAT and import duties on a value of 150 instead of 200. It's a principle that is applied in many countries all over the world. But it has been subject to discussions, and there is quite a fair chance that European authorities, that they will abolish this rule in the new legislation of 2013. We have seen drafts where they indeed abolished that rule. But yeah, until 2013, there's still a lot of lobbying that can be done, and obviously a lot of importers are lobbying not to have that abolishment of that rule. But it's under discussion, so I wanted to mention that to you. Another thing is the dutability of royalties and license fees. It's one of the big trends in Europe, whereby custom authorities trying to increase their resources, whereby they do a lot of investigations with importers to see whether the importer does not pay royalties, and then to see whether those royalties should not be included in the customs value, meaning that I am an importer, I have an invoice for 100, I get an invoice for the importation by the Korean company for 100, but I also have to pay $50 to the Korean company as royalty fees for the use of the brand, etc., or for distribution, to get a license to distribute the Korean goods into Europe. And there's a lot of investigation going on, whereby they say, whereby custom authorities, they try to include those royalties into the customs value. One of the last drafts that we've seen is that they will reduce the conditions to include those royalties into the customs value to only one condition, and that the only condition will be will the exporter export the goods to Europe if the royalty is paid, yes or no. So they will look, it is a bit of a contraction, and they will look at the contracts between the European importer and the exporter, or a third party, because it goes as well for goods manufactured in Korea and royalties paid to the license holder in Luxembourg or the United States, for example. So the only condition that will be in the future, in the new draft, is that if the exporter will not deliver the goods if the royalty isn't paid, it has to be included. No matter if the royalty is related to the goods, yes or no. No matter what type of royalty it is. No, it will be included. That's the last draft of the text. It will be included if it is a condition for the sale of the goods to the importer. So, two things to remind, because 2013 is quite near. There have been words that it could be postponed, but, well, you never know. July 2013, it's only 2 years from now. So that was the general introduction on Europe and on the European customs policy and the European Customs Union. Let's now move on to the FTA. The FTA that you have been discussing in detail the whole day from this morning until now. The FTA, as you all know, is quite new. It's quite a new FTA, at least for European purposes, because old school FTAs, they merely focused on trade in goods, while this FTA is a lot broader, and it has dispositions on IP law, it has dispositions on market access, on competition rules, service supplier, etc., etc. But for this part, for my part of the presentation, I will, let's say, only keep the old school part of the FTA in mind, and that is the tariff elimination with respect to goods, because origin is obviously only important to determine whether your goods are eligible for preferential access to the EU, yes or no. We have this FTA. How will I now know that my goods, the goods that I'm manufacturing here in Korea or in the EU, whether those goods will be subject to preferential access? Well, there are two elements that are important for me. The first is the classification of the goods. I understand that the previous speaker spoke about classification of goods, so I will not elaborate too much on that. I didn't understand what he said, but I guess that he explained the basic rules for classification. And the second part is origin, obviously, as this is the main theme of the presentation. So, Annex 2A of the FTA, and I don't know if you all got a copy of that, but Annex 2A of the FTA refers to the reduced rates for each good. Each good is classified in a staging category, meaning that what is important, the classification. If I know my classification of the good, I will be able to determine what is the actual rate and what is the rate, the preferential rate that will be applicable, and when will it be applicable. All that is mentioned per category, per classification in the annex to the FTA. Yeah, the staging category, that means if we take back the example, staging category 0, that means that that particular type of goods, in this case peel of citrus fruit or melons, that particular type of good, that will be subject to preferential access at the 0 rate as from the moment that the FTA enters into force, meaning as of 1st of July 2011, if I export peels of citrus to Korea or vice versa, this product will no longer be subject to the 1.6 import duty rate, but will be subject to the 0 rate under the FTA. Now you have all kind of staging categories, but for example, if the annex mentions staging category 5, that means that custom duties will be reduced gradually in 6 annual phases, not immediately, so not as from 1 of July to 0, but gradually to 0, starting 1 of July in 6 annual periods to finally reach the 0 rate. So just this example to show you that classification is the first important thing to do when you look, when you try to establish whether your goods are eligible for preferential treatment in the EU or in Korea. Classification is the first thing to do. Under which classification fall my goods? Okay? So, classification, I guess that you all know that, and that it is widely explained. But in Europe, we usually classify the goods under a 10 or 11 digit code. It's the tariff code which is applicable. But it is based on the same tarification or the same classification rules that are applicable in Korea or in most of the WTO members countries. So the classification will not only be relevant for to establish why, when, and if the good is eligible for preferential access. No, the classification is also important to see whether there are no anti-dumping duties applicable, yes or no, on your good, whether there are no quotas applicable on your good. All kind of economic measures, they are also attached to this classification. So classification is very important. And therefore, because it's so important, and because it's easy to make a mistake, because that is something that everyone has to remind, of course, it's very important, and it's good as a company to have a good process or a well-established process to establish that classification. If you don't have that, it's very easy to make mistake against classifications. And as you see, what are the you can see what could be the consequences of a mistake in classifications. Your product can be eligible for anti-dumping duties, can be eligible to quotas, etc., etc. So you have to make sure that you have a good established process within your company, or depend on a third party, of course, to see that the classification of your product is the right one. If you're not sure, if you doubt, if you say, well, I don't know, and we have discussed this with other people in the business, and you know, it's difficult to, is this a toy, or is this a teddy bear, or is this a bike? What is it? We're not sure. It can be classification A, or it can be classification B. In case of doubt, the European Union foresees in a ruling mechanism whereby you can present your case to the custom authority of one of the 27 member states, and they will then make a decision based on the elements you presented. That decision is called a BTI, binding tariff instruction. Binding tariff instruction. That BTI gives you legal certainty about the classification for at least 6 years. So if you doubt and you say, well, I want some legal certainty about that, it is very easy to present your case to one of the 27 custom authorities in the European Union, and they will make a decision. That decision will be valid throughout the European Union. So it's not because Dutch custom authorities issued the BTI that it will not be valid in Spain or in Italy. No, it will be valid throughout the European Union. It will only be stopped, so to say, if there is new legislation, for example. You can obtain a BTI on a specific type of good, but if there is, let's say, 2 years later, a regulation issued by the European authorities that says, well, for us it's no longer a television, but it's a video recorder, this product, then obviously your BTI stops giving you legal certainty, and you have to apply for a new BTI if there's still some doubt. So that is important. If you doubt the classification, you can obtain a BTI with one of the 27 member states, and then you have legal certainty in principle for 6 years. This is a bit how the tariff classification is built. As you can see, it all follows the common rules that are widely discussed and bespoken at WTO and WCO level. So you will certainly see some similarities. An example I took from the jurisprudence by the ECG. Because that is also one important element that has legislative power in the European Union, that are the decisions made by the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice, in its cases, they sometimes comment the legislation that exists at EU level. They comment the regulations that exist in customs law, and that those decisions made by the ECG, they have legislative power. So if there is a court case that says it's no longer a television receiver, dear importer or dear customs authority, no, this type of product is a video recorder, then that decision has legislative power. So it can be worth to check the decisions that are already made, if you're doubting, that are already made by the ECG. It can also be important that it's perhaps something I forgot to say. The European authorities, they have a good database of BTIs that were issued in the past. So it might be that one of your competitors who also doubted the classification of a certain product, it might be that he already asked for a ruling on the classification. That ruling, without the name of the importer, of course, but that ruling specifying the rules that are applicable, that ruling is normally very easily accessible on a database that is on the EU customs website. So just for your reference. So this was a court case on set-top boxes with communication function and a hard disk. So there was doubt between the custom authorities of several EU member states. One said that it was a television receiver, the other said that it was a video recorder. Finally, the ECG made the decision, and they said no, it's a television receiver, so it's subject to 0% import duty instead of 13.9. So just this example to say classification, to say once again, classification is important. It's the first step if you want to see whether your goods are eligible for EU Korea FTA, yes or no. Another example, bicycle, baby bicycle, is that a bicycle that falls under code 8712, or is it a wheeled toy that falls under 9503? It can be important. The difference can be important, well, because a bicycle will fall under staging category 3 of the agreement, meaning that in 4 annual phases the custom duty will be reduced to 0, and a wheeled toy will fall under staging category 0, what means that as from July 1st, 2011, that product will be subject to 0 rate when exported to the EU. So let's talk about origin. That is the second step. Origin is the second step. We have decided on the classification. We have established the classification of our product. We know what the current import duties are when they are imported in the European Union. We know under which staging category they fall in the EU-Korea FTA. So we know when the duty is reducing. We have established that. Then now it is important to establish whether that good meets the origin criteria that are mentioned in the EU FTA. And before we go to the details of that, let's first speak about the general principle of origin. What is origin? What does that mean? Well, origin is the nationality of a product. It's not the source. If I import a bicycle from China and I export it from Korea to the European Union, that bicycle will not have Korean origin just because it's exported from Korea. No, it's not the source that counts, it's where it is obtained. That is important. Origin is just like classification. It's a very important element, not only for tariff classification, not only to establish the tariff, but also to establish whether anti-dumping duties are applicable, import licenses, regulatory things like environmental legislation, REACH legislation. Some of you probably heard of that, which is also applicable in Europe for chemical products. REACH legislation that will also be dependable, and your obligations under REACH will also depend on the classification of your particular product and on the origin of your particular product. So origin and classifications are not only important for tariffs, but also for many other economic and regulatory measures that are applicable. In Europe, we have two types of origin. There's first non-preferential origin, and there's preferential origin. There are a lot of similarities between the two, between those two concepts. But there might be differences as well. What is non-preferential origin? Non-preferential origin determines the economic measures that are applicable. So the rules to establish non-preferential origin, they are all described in that regulation, which I mentioned some slides ago. That regulation, the Customs Community Code, that regulation, that has the rules to establish the non-preferential origin of a product. There are a lot of similar rules with preferential origin, but there are differences as well. Non-preferential origin, that will determine whether economic measures are applicable, yes or no. In other words, whether anti-dumping duties are applicable, whether quota are applicable, whether environmental legislation is applicable, whether REACH legislation is applicable, etc., etc., etc. So that's economic. Try to link those two elements. Non-preferential origin determines the economic measures that can be applicable. Then there's preferential origin. Preferential origin, those rules, that preferential origin, that will be the criteria to determine whether your product gets preferential treatment. Preferential treatment, in other words, whether lower import duties or nil import duties will be applicable. So the non-preferential origin is the economic, determines the applicability of economic measures. The preferential origin, that determines whether you have to pay more or less taxes, import duties. So that's the fiscal definition. The definition for preferential origin is for a part reflected in the Community Custom Code as well. But the major rules, they are stipulated in the agreements that are concluded between the European Union and the other countries or regions with whom they agreed a preferential trade agreement. So the rules to determine whether a good has preferential origin, they are mostly stipulated, for the biggest part stipulated, in the agreements itself. It's not in the Community Customs Code, no, it's in the agreement itself. As you see, I've made some a table on that. And you can see that preferential origin indeed determines whether lower import duties are applicable, yes or no. The rules are determined in the FTAs themselves, and which is often not the case for non-preferential origin. There is always an element in preferential origin whereby you have to prove that your goods comply with that preferential origin. That is very important. You have to prove that. There is always an element. There are always some requirements in all FTAs that have been concluded that say, how should I prove that my good meets the origin criteria? That's not the case. That's almost never the case with non-preferential origin, but it is always the case with preferential origin. And that proof can be different. We will elaborate more on that after the coffee break, but that proof can be in the format of an EUR1 or a Form A certificate. Certificates that are issued or authorized by an authority itself, by the customs authority or by a chamber of commerce or alike. Or it can be just a mention that is made on an invoice. You can do, as an exporter, you can declare that yourself. And then there's still an authority that comes into that process, but we will discuss that further after the break. So, non-preferential origin. Just an example on non-preferential origin. Non-preferential origin affects anti-dumping duties. I know that there is an existing anti-dumping duty for stranded wires, ropes and cables of iron and steel under that specific code that are originating in the EU. Well, the origin of those stranded wires will be determined based on the rules that are applicable under the Community Customs Code. You don't have to read the EU-Korea FTA to determine whether those anti-dumping duties are applicable, yes or no. No, the EU-Korea FTA has nothing to do with anti-dumping duties, because anti-dumping duties, they link or they relate to a concept of origin which is non-preferential origin. That is important. So don't forget about that, and that's one of the remarks I wanted to make. I think it's obvious, but, well, I wanted to give it to you, of course. The FTA has nothing to do with anti-dumping duties. The fact that certain Korean products or European products in vice versa for import in Korea, there's the fact that certain Korean products are now subject to anti-dumping duties. That will not change with the FTA. The FTA has nothing to do with anti-dumping duties, quotas, or other economic measures. Those measures are linked to non-preferential origin. The FTA is linked to preferential origin. So if you will export stranded wires 2nd of July 2011, they will still be subject to 60% anti-dumping duties. If you will export those stranded wires within 5 years, they will still be subject to 60% anti-dumping duty, unless if the anti-dumping duty is reconsidered. But that's an whole other process. It has nothing to do with the FTA. That's important to remember from this slide, is the fact that anti-dumping duties, quotas, other requirements are linked to non-preferential origin, and they have nothing to do with the origin concept in the FTA. So, where are the rules? Where are the rules that determine whether a product is of origin Korea, of origin EU? Where can I find those rules? As I said, they are partly, from a European perspective, the principles are partly in the customs code, but the main rules, the specific rules, they are all elaborated in each FTA. If you want to know if your products are eligible, if my EU products are eligible for preferential access in Chile under the EU-Chile agreement, I have to take the EU-Chile agreement, I have to look for the protocol on origin, and in that protocol on origin, I will find the rules that determine whether my product is yes or no. If yes or no, it has EU origin under that protocol, and if yes or no, if it has that EU origin, if they can access Chile with preferential access. So if I want to know whether my goods are eligible for preferential access under the EU-Korea FTA, I look at the EU-Korea FTA and I take the protocol. And in that protocol, the rules are established to see whether my product qualifies yes or no. So I tried to summarize the questions that you have to ask yourself when looking at the protocol and when looking at your goods and when trying to establish whether your goods are eligible yes or no. I try to summarize the questions you have to ask yourself into this decision tree. And I will discuss the questions one by one, and we will come back to this decision tree once I have elaborated on all those questions. But please, if we go further through the slides, please have a look. Continue to have a look at this, because that is those are the questions And this is the decision tree that you have to take in mind when trying to establish whether your products are eligible for beneficial access, yes or no. So, the first question, if you take your product, the first question you have to ask yourself is my product wholly obtained, yes or no? What does that mean, wholly obtained? That means that the product is, for example, grown and harvested in that country. If I have rice which has grown in Korea and that is harvested here and I export that to the European Union, well, anyway, there can be no doubt that that rice has Korean origin and that this rice is eligible under the EU-Korea FTA for beneficial access in Europe. Another example, stock. If I have animals that are born here and grown in Korea and I export this delicious Korean beef to the European Union, well, then there's no doubt. It also goes for products that are made. For example, if I make rice crackers from Korean rice that is grown and harvested here, it's obviously that those rice crackers are wholly obtained here. And that they have Korean origin and that there's no doubt that those rice crackers will be eligible for the EU-Korea FTA. That's the first question that you have to ask yourself. If that's not the case, if you cannot determine that the goods are wholly obtained here because, for example, the rice crackers are made partly of Japanese rice or partly of Chinese rice or partly or wholly of Vietnamese rice. So if there are more countries involved, more countries outside Korea, or if you would look at it the other way, more countries outside the 27 member states, because we look at the 27 member states as a whole. If there are more countries involved, then we have to take the next step. And the next step is to see whether there is sufficient processing, yes or no. Are the goods here in Korea sufficiently processed to give them Korean origin, yes or no? If I make rice crackers out of Japanese rice, can I say that that process is sufficiently to give it Korean origin? That is the question one has to ask themselves. But before we could see whether the process is sufficiently, and whether they are sufficiently processed, yes or no, we first will eliminate some cases. So the second question to be asked then is, are they not insufficiently processed? Because there are clear rules that describe whether a product is insufficiently processed, yes or no. For example, if my good is only packed here in Japan, if I import rice crackers from Japan and I just pack them here in Korea, that is insufficient processing. Meaning that if that is the case, my rice crackers will never have Korean origin. Because the only process that took place here in the EU, in Korea, is a packaging operation. If my textiles are just labeled or ironed or pressed here in Korea, if the Chinese textiles are only ironed, pressed or labeled here in Korea, even if the label would say made in Korea, that is insufficient processing. So my goods will never get Korean origin by that process. And the protocol on origin has a long list of processes that are considered to be insufficient. That long list is a copy of all other FTAs. If you would look at the EU-Chile FTA or the EU-Mercosur FTA, whatever, all the FTAs have this list of insufficient working or processing methods. So if the processing is considered to be insufficient, because I only bleach or polish the rice, or only husk the rice, if that is the case, my good will never have Korean origin. And I can forget about the EU-Korea FTA. So, if our processing does not fall under one of the criteria that are mentioned, and that are considered to be insufficient working or processing, then we have to see. I made an example. I think you can easily read it there. But if my goods are insufficiently, if I have established that the processing is not an insufficient processing, then I have to go back to the protocol. I doubt the origin because I'm sure that it's not wholly obtained. I'm also sure that it's not insufficient processing. So there's still a chance that my goods can get Korean origin. How can I find out whether they have Korean origin, yes or no? I have to go back to the protocol. And Annex 2 and Annex 2A of the origin protocol, they indicate for all products covered by the agreement what processing or what working is sufficient to give it Korean origin. And those criteria can be different. And there are three types of criteria. Either you have a process criterion, meaning, I will come back on that later. Either you have a value added or a percentage criterion, or you have a combination of both. But it depends on the product. You have to go to the protocol, to Annex 2A. You have to look for your good, your particular type of good that you have classified according to the rules. And there you will find the rules that say when is the processing sufficient to give it Korean origin or to give it EU origin. So what is the process criterion? If the process criterion that mentions that the imported materials must have undergone substantial transformation. And how do they determine substantial transformation? Because, of course, substantial transformation, it can be everything. And they say, well, if the final product qualifies under a different tariff classification as those from the imported materials, then it will get Korean origin. If I import all kind of goods, let's say, if I will make a lawnmower and I will use for the production of that lawnmower, I will use elements or parts that come from China or from Japan. They will only get Korean origin. That lawnmower will only get Korean origin if the final classification, if the final tariff classification of the lawnmower is different from the parts that I used. Which is, in case of a lawnmower, very difficult. Because the classification of a lawnmower includes sometimes some parts of a lawnmower are made under the same classification. But this just as an example. Another example, with respect to the import of baker's ware of rice, under codes classified under code 1905 in the EU, South Korean origin applies when it's manufactured from non-originating materials of any heading except that of the product. So that is the rule that is mentioned in the protocol on origin. That rule says that if the final product has a different tariff classification as the parts that were used for that final product, it will get Korean origin. So there's sufficient processing. So when Japanese rice heading, classified under heading 1006 is used for manufacturing rice crackers in South Korea, the rice crackers will be of Korean origin. Because the final product, rice crackers, is classified under code 1905, and the ingredient, rice, is classified under 1006. Hope this is clear. Another important element that I maybe forgot is that what is very special in the Korean EU FTA is that we have an allowed drawback rule. All other FTAs that the EU concluded, they do not have that specific, they all have this clause that says you cannot benefit from the FTA if the parts that you used to make a product, if you get refund of the import duties that you paid yourself for those parts. I make a lawnmower, I import goods from China and from Japan. On the importation of those parts, I will pay, as a manufacturer, I will pay import duties. If I get those import duties back, if I ask refund of those import duties, a general FTA always stipulates that if you ask refund for the parts, you can never benefit from the agreement. The EU-Korea FTA says if you ask refund, you can benefit from the FTA. If you manufacture your goods under suspension of import duties because you use an inward processing regime, for example, that allows you to import goods and manufacture a new type of good under suspension of custom duties, you can still benefit from the FTA. So that's very special for the EU-Korea FTA. And there was, I think, probably the only element that was subject for discussion in the European Union, because a lot of I guess you all know, but a lot of car manufacturers, European car manufacturers, they had some problems with the fact that they have to pay import duties when they use Chinese parts to manufacture a car in Germany, and that a Korean car manufacturer that would manufacture cars in Korea with Chinese parts, that they would get their import duties on the parts back from the European Union, from Korea. So this example just to show that this FTA has a specific clause that says that you can ask for a drawback of duties on the parts that you use. So a second criterion. So I go back. I go one step back. In order to determine whether a good is sufficiently processed, yes or no, we look at the protocol. In the protocol, per tariff classification, per classification of a good, we will see the conditions that are required in order to speak of sufficiently processed, yes or no. There are three possible criteria. First criteria is the process criteria. So the final result of my manufacturing, of my processing, is a new type of good that falls under another classification. Another criteria that might be applicable is the percentage criteria. That means, that says that even if my end product doesn't have another classification, then it still can get Korean origin if the parts used in that new product, the parts that I used and that are non-originating Korea or non-originating EU, if those parts used, the value of those parts used doesn't exceed a certain percentage of the ex-factory value of the final product. So that is a second criteria that might be applicable, and that you can find in the protocol on origin. For example, a television reception apparatus under heading 8528 is manufactured so that the value of all foreign is considered sufficiently processed when the value of all foreign materials used to manufacture that television reception apparatus in Korea or in the EU does not exceed 45% of the ex-works price of the product. So, if I manufacturing a television set in South Korea and I sell it for 100 to a European importer, and all the parts are Korean, except that one part, which is the Chinese chip, and has value 20, I can still call my television set a Korean television set, and it benefits from preferential access, because the value of the foreign materials that I used does not exceed 45%. Which is a general rule under the EU FTA. It generally speaks of 45% foreign materials that can be available in a product. Or, third criteria, you have the processing criteria. You could have the percentage criteria, or you can have a combination of both. For example, a milking machine and a dairy machine, that says it will get, it is considered, a milking machine and a dairy machine is considered to be sufficiently processed if, rule 1, it is manufactured from materials of any heading except that of the product. So if it's only composed of foreign content, if it's only composed of foreign content that doesn't have the same code as the final product, or if the value of all materials used does not exceed 45% of the ex-works price of the product. In that, if the protocol stipulates that, the combination of the two rules, it is the exporter who has the choice, or the importer who has the choice. You can choose either to apply the process criterion, either to apply the percentage criterion. It can be important because, and then I go to the 10% allowance rule. What is the 10% allowance rule? It is a general waiver, so to say, whereby one allows 10% value of non-origin materials added. So if there's only 10% of foreign materials, it will have no impact on the origin. That is important, especially important if one has the combination of the two rules. If one can opt either to apply the processing criteria, either to apply the percentage criterion. Because if I would use the processing criterion and I would be manufacturing a Lawnmower here in Korea, and there would still be an element, I would use the process criteria, and I would use, let's say, 10 parts, and one of the parts that I use has the same heading as the final product. I could have a problem, but I could only have a problem if the value of that part doesn't exceed 10%. Because there's a general allowance of 10%. And that general allowance that usually does not play if one uses the percentage criterion. Then it's always 35%. It can be important. Another general rule is that bilateral cumulation is allowed. That simply means that if you would manufacture a television set in Korea and the only foreign parts that you would use are of EU origin, obviously there will not be a problem, even if that's 60% or 80% foreign materials. If they have EU origin, the EU origin is assimilated with Korean origin, and your good will be considered, let's say, as 100% of Korean origin and will have no problems to benefit from the EU-Korean FTA. So, let's come back to our decision scheme. how shall we establish the origin of a product? First step, is it wholly obtained, yes or no? Yes, no problem. It will have Korean origin and it will benefit from the treaty. No. Then we have to ask the second question. What is the second question? The second question is there an insufficient treatment of the product? Is it only be packed? Is it only be painted? Is it only be... You have to look at the list that is mentioned in the origin protocol, and if your processing in Korea does not fall under that list, you have to move on to the third question. If it falls under that list, you are sure that your product will not have Korean origin. So, there's insufficient treatment. My product will not have Korean origin. My treatment doesn't fall under the definition of insufficient treatment. I have to move on. I have to ask the third question. What is the third question? The third question is, we go back to the protocol and we look which criterion is applicable for the product concerned. So we go to the list, to the annex list, we look for our product and we see what is the criteria that is applicable for this type of good that I'm manufacturing. Is it the process criteria? Is it the manufacturing criteria? Is it the percentage criteria? Or is it a combination of both? Then we have to see, is the criteria met? Yes or no? Is it met? Yes, my product will have Korean origin. Is it not met? Well, then I'm sure that it doesn't have Korean origin and that I cannot benefit from the treaty. So, hope that helps. There are also... The agreement also foresees in some particular rules, for example, but those are all very similar to what is mentioned in all other treaties that have been concluded by the European Union. Accessories, spare parts and tools, if they are included in the price and they are delivered together with the main product, they are considered to have the origin as the main product. For example, if I go to IKEA and I buy a closet, and with that closet there is this screwdriver, that screwdriver, even if it's if my closet is has Korean origin, the screwdriver will also have Korean origin, even if the screwdriver is made in China or is made somewhere else. So if it's a part, an accessory, a tool that is delivered with the main product, it normally has the same origin as the main product. That is something to remind. Sets of goods, if you have a variety of goods that are delivered, the main rule there is that they are considered to be originating in a country when all component products are originating. So you have to look at each product separately to determine their origin, and if all the products meet the origin criteria, you go through all the questions for each product, and if they all meet the origin criteria, they obviously will benefit from the EU-Korea FTA. If there's one or two or three that are not meeting those criteria, you have to know that there is a 15% allowance rule that says if it's only 15% of the set that is delivered, we agree to give the set Korean origin. So we have established a classification. We have established the origin of our product. We know that our product is eligible for EU-Korean FTA. There's still one thing to check, because there is still one very important condition to that EU-Korea FTA, to all FTAs actually, and that says that it only applies, you can only get preferential access if there is direct transport of the goods to the European Union. Direct transport, that does not mean That does not mean that you cannot stop. That does not mean that that your ship has to go directly from Seoul to Antwerp or from Seoul to Rotterdam. You can make a stop in Dubai or whatever place. But whenever you make a stop, you should be sure that the goods are under customs supervision. You cannot put the goods in free circulation. You can unload your ship in Dubai. You can store the goods in Dubai. You can even do certain treatment of the goods. Probably very similar. The treatment that is allowed is very similar to what is considered to be insufficient processing. So repackaging, trying to create the conditions that your goods can be stored safely and can be stored good. So that is allowed. But at all times, the goods must be under customs supervision. You cannot put the goods into free circulation. Even if it would be cheaper, for example, because obviously storing goods under customs supervision is usually more expensive than declaring them in Dubai, even if your goods are not subject to import duties in Dubai. You can never do that. Your goods must have been under customs supervision the whole trip. You can store them for 6 months in Dubai, no problem, but they should be under customs supervision. Don't forget that. And if they are, they will be granted beneficial access. If they are not, and that is something that happened a lot. There's a lot of jurisprudence and there are a lot of cases known in Europe, especially with textiles coming from South America. A lot of those textiles before being exported to Europe, they were stored in the US. And although those textiles, they arrived into Europe with a certificate, a Euro 1 certificate or a Form A certificate, that stated that they had Honduras or Venezuela origin, and so they were eligible for preferential access into Europe, that preferential access was refused because they were stored in the US without customs supervision. Because they could enter duty-free the US, the exporter, he thought, well, why bother and with all that customs supervision? Let's just rent a warehouse, store them there for several weeks, and then ship them to the European Union. But preferential access was actually denied because there was no direct transport. European authorities didn't consider the storage in the EU to be direct transport because they were removed from customs supervision. So, important to remember. And then I think that we're up to a coffee break, if everyone agrees, and that we move on after the coffee break, and that we will discuss in detail the documentation that is required under the FTA and the rules that are already existing in Europe in that respect. Many thanks, and have a good coffee break.